Hello everybody. I hope you're all feeling like ready for a bit of a history lesson, a bit of forward-looking stuff as well, a little bit of challenge, and then actually sort of intimidatingly, there's some really amazingly talented people in the room. So I think one of the primary things you're going to get from today is some networking as well and some good connections from people in this room. So thank you so much for being here. Just a bit of sense check to start with. Talking about natural capital in its broader sense, who here sort of feels that they are kind of pretty expert? You know, you kind of know what you're talking about. You're just here for the CPD points, to sell something to someone. Yes, thank you, well done. One. Okay, who here is happy to say they're an absolute beginner? No kind of, like maybe you've heard it mentioned once or twice. Brilliant, okay, that's great. My intention is by the time we've finished this section, you'll have like hopefully a basic understanding of what's been going on in this space, what you need to think about, where it's all come from, and then kind of, you know, some basic steps that everybody can take away with. And then John, you're going to come in and do some amazing kind of carbon related kind of technical stuff and explain what you've been getting on with. So we'll get kind of more technical as we go through the day, and then there's a discussion session later on as well. So I think probably park questions. Laura, how did you want to do this? So basically, if there's a point of principle or I've said something you don't understand, please stick your hand up. It's that classic thing about being at school. If you haven't understood it or I've said something stupid, like challenge me on it there and then because somebody else will be asking it. But if you want to have a debate about the ethics of the carbon markets, which we can also do, let's park it for the end and we'll kind of like get to that kind of interesting kind of nuggety stuff a bit later on, right? So burning kind of passions on that sort of thing do tend to come up at these events, but we'll get to that later on. So natural capital and me, right? Well, I applied for the job at Savills as head of rural research back in 2018. And for my interview for that job, the guys there said, we want you to do a presentation on natural capital and opportunities for Savills. And I hadn't even heard of natural capital at that point. And so I spent a little bit of time getting a presentation together and put this presentation together for this particular interview, got the job, and then spent an awful lot of time thinking about natural capital and what impact it was having on everything from the way that institutional owners and the biggest in the country were kind of completely repurposing their ownership portfolios to think about things in this way, right down to kind of the nuts and bolts of some of the emerging markets that were happening. So it was an amazing kind of roller coaster and kind of thinking through where this stuff is coming from and how it's going to impact us all going forwards. And so it's kind of an honor today to be here kind of sharing some of this stuff with you. So what do we mean by natural capital? Let's start at the beginning. So this definition is from the Natural England's recent report on the state of natural capital in England specifically. And it talks about the parts of nature that provide benefits to people. So whether it's air we're breathing, water we're drinking, the food we eat, it's sort of quite personal in terms of kind of the bits that we're going to value, the bits that are valuable to us. And there's some prominent critics of this kind of approach, people like George Monbiot, who will look at the planet in its totality and saying we should be protecting this, we should be preserving it and valuing it, not because it's valuable to us, but because it's valuable per se. Right? So it's not a completely uncontested methodology, but some of the people in the space have been saying that, well, we haven't been doing this, we haven't been valuing natural capital at all, and that's why we've been creating a lot of the problems that have been going on here with degradation and sort of general declines that we keep seeing. So we're kind of in accepting that we're talking about the bit that's going to be valuable, and because it's valuable, it becomes relevant. So thinking this through, natural capital, it's that stock of natural resources that we see all around us, geology, soils, air, it's everything that, you know, as farmers and landowners, we kind of see and get to manipulate, right? It's that physical nature of stuff around us. But importantly, it provides ecosystem services. And it's these ecosystem services that begin to get us into this idea of value and opportunity. Okay, so ecosystem services are those benefits to society. Food and fibre, carbon sequestration, pollination, water regulation, all of those different elements of things that we know to be valuable to us. But nature-based solutions are the bit where we get really interesting, right? Because these are the bits where we can kind of create an action, we can do something differently, and by doing something differently, we create that opportunity to create value out of it. A financial transaction, essentially, that causes a different management approach to happen, and it's that different management approach which, in theory, should present a better outcome for nature. So we think about those three things. Those three terms are the really important ones to remember. Natural capital is everything. Ecosystem services are the flows of value that are coming to society from natural capital, and nature-based solutions are the things that we can do, the interventions that we can make that create value. Now, where has this come from? I think it's quite important to remember this because particularly there's still a lot of cynicism, understandable cynicism in agriculture and in farmers about how important this stuff really is, particularly when we think about things like carbon. But it's quite important to remember there's fairly kind of like deep-seated approaches going on here. So the Stern Review in 2006 looked at the costs of delaying action on climate change. And it's that point about costs of climate change. It's cheaper to act now than it is to wait for these consequences to come through and those to be there in the future. Now, that led to the Climate Change Act 2008. And then not long after that was the John Norton review on making space for nature, and who basically said that nature is too fragmented in England in order to be resilient, and how can we then do something about that particularly. Then there was this guy, Dieter Helm. Everybody heard of Dieter Helm? He was particularly good academic, aligned with government, the Conservative government at this particular time. And then it all led to this command paper 2011. This is Caroline Spellman when she was Secretary of State. And it did loads of things in this particular paper. It was the first white paper for nature since 1990. And there's loads of stuff in there that we now think of as being kind of quite normal, but at the time was pretty revolutionary. So it talks about local nature partnerships. It talked about reforming the planning system, including biodiversity offsets. It talked about the creation of the Natural Capital Committee and expanding markets and payments for things like ecosystem services. So at the time, people would have read that and think, oh, this is all alien language. But, you know, this was really where this stuff has come from. And so Natural Capital Committee was chaired by Dieter Helm, and he became effectively Michael Gove's outsourced brain on natural capital matters. But at that early stage, there were probably two policy consequences. You know, this is sort of early work. The first one was just generally a commitment to doing better for nature, the acknowledgement that things were pretty bad and declining and probably still are. And the second was this idea of getting nature on the balance sheet, but not just a corporate balance sheet. This is like government balance sheet. So how is government thinking about this stuff, not just how we're thinking about it at farm level? And so then Brexit happened, and we had this... text at the top is too big. We should have proofread this last night, Laura. We did proofread this last night and didn't spot it. So new legal targets, basically, is what it says. So you just get this sudden, avalanche of new regulatory opportunities because they're having to innovate all of this stuff. So it wasn't that the European Union was really stopping us thinking about these things. It's just we hadn't had the opportunity to line things up in a way that was very consistent with our domestic targets. And so we've had this huge amount of innovation since. The first one being the Environment Act 2018, which bakes in principles of natural capital within the overall environmental framework. Biodiversity net gain, public money for public goods, and the polluter pays principle. It's these kind of like core foundational things that now sit within legislation the government is now holding itself to account on. And generally, they've just published last week. The Office for Environmental Protection has done its 2024 review. We're still not doing good enough. Government is still way off target. It's still not getting to its goals. And so there's huge amounts of criticism going on within government space. Government itself has said it's reviewing the way the environmental improvement plan is going to be structured within that, because at the moment it hasn't got the link between the targets and the evidence. And I think that this is something really important that farming needs to watch for, because at the moment, SFI, great, there's lots of different pots of money available to do lots of different activities, but the evidence link between what we are being paid to do under that scheme and how it influences outcomes under the environmental improvement plan is really weak. And so we're going to get, I think, this much more, closer alignment between the schemes and the environmental outcomes that are going to come from that space. That's also going to require more data and more baselines in order to be able to demonstrate improvement. So I think this whole space around environmental regulation is going to change, particularly over the next few months. And then we've also got the Climate Change Act, which Theresa May, if you can remember, one of her last acts as Prime Minister was to change the target, so we're now net zero by 2050. And this is putting pressure on land because this is decarbonising the entire economy and every sector within it. And in order to be able to do that, we need to be thinking about the land base that we've got and thinking about it differently. So the Climate Change Committee has been putting out some really interesting, I call them interesting, that's my euphemism for, when somebody says, oh, we could go and do that, I say, that's an interesting idea, yeah, by which I mean rubbish. But I don't mean it's rubbish, I just mean it's interesting because it's so challenging for how we think about the limited land base and also our autonomy to make decisions over our land as well. And it's going to put real pressure on agriculture as a sector of the economy within the total picture, right? Because this is about measuring what we're producing as an economy, not what we're consuming as an economy, what we're producing from here. It means we need kind of a 68% reduction in total by 2030. Agriculture is currently 10%. If we do nothing, we will be 30%. As we think about countries who are currently acting in a fairly heavy way on carbon emissions, we might think about Ireland and Northern Ireland, and John will talk to us about that in a bit. We might think about what's happened in Denmark. They're all heavily agricultural producing countries, and New Zealand is the same, right? So they know that that's why agriculture has been sort of targeted within those economies, because it's responsible for a much bigger proportion of the overall emissions profile. And it will be the same for us in 5 short years if we do nothing. And that's why there's this kind of ramping up of pressure to say, what are we doing about some of these issues? Okay, so the ambition of natural capital. This is kind of where we are at the moment on the left. Actually, this particular image is 5 years old, maybe actually older than that, 7 years old. I've used it fairly excessively. We've got this situation where the government wants this environmental aspiration to be higher. It wants to be getting up to that green line. And it's got a really limited pot of cash to be able to do that, right? The money to invest in these things, to pay for these particular outcomes, to create these interventions isn't there. And it's relying on a relatively weak regulatory baseline in order to be able to do any of these activities, right? And so the speculation is, and we see evidence of this all of the time, that it wants to get to this much higher natural capital valuation, this kind of picture of the country where it's all singing, all dancing, all beautiful, right? But it needs to blend together the money that's available from the public sector with money that's available from the private sector. And I stand by this, that regulatory baseline needs to get tougher. And again, that's written into the government's response to the Office for Environmental Protection's annual report just last week, saying, they very seriously, where there is limited, what was their language? Where there's limited levers in order to achieve goals. So, for example, all of their targets for farmland are dependent upon the environmental land management schemes. They say they're having to explicitly consider other levers that are available to them, including regulation, right? So it's basically saying SFI is optional. It's entirely up to us whether we do it, but it means that they're not meeting their goals for farmland outcomes. So how are they using other governmental nudges that are available to them? And so I think that compliance baseline, we just need to be aware it's going to get tougher, right? But that's at government level. That's their ambition. The other issue is got the way that this is regulating corporate behaviour. And I think this is the particularly interesting bit, because these pressures on green finance and things like the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which John will pick up on as well, are kind of causing corporates to think differently. So if you think about businesses like Nestle, some of the biggest businesses are listed businesses, and in their annual disclosures, they have to now start telling the world what their carbon emissions footprint is. Okay, so Tesco's is doing the same, McCain's is doing the same, Lloyds Bank is doing the same. They're all kind of coming up with these things, these messages that are saying, hang on, farming, you're an issue. You're an issue for us, and we need to start working with you differently and changing our behaviours towards the supply chain and the supply base in order to create different outcomes, because at the moment we're showing up as a problem for them. And I'll just show you these kind of series of slides to kind of demonstrate why we're a problem. So scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Anyone familiar with this language around carbon disclosures? A couple of nods, okay, a couple. Good, thank you. There's other people who don't know this at all, right? So for a retailer, when they're doing their carbon disclosures and they're having to work out, adding up what their carbon disclosures are each year, their scope 1 is the things that are directly relevant to them. So it'll be the heating in their shops and maybe the refrigeration in their storage systems. And you can largely deal with those by switching to renewable energy, right? And so your scope 2 emissions are the things, the sources of energy in your heat and electricity. Now, this whole kind of thinking, this methodology is all set at global level. This is a standardized framework, right? Your scope 3 emissions are the things that you are indirectly responsible for on your value chain. Okay, and so for a retailer, an agri-food retailer, those scope 3 emissions will be things like food production, it will be packaging, and it will also be consumer waste. So the things that they're creating as a result of their business model relating to where carbon is coming from. And for a bank, it would be the same. Scope 1, office costs. Scope 2, source of energy. Scope 3 includes their funded emissions. The amount of money that they are lending, say, to the oil and gas sector or to agriculture would be showing up as their funded emissions, what their money is enabling emissions to happen. And the same would be for a farm. You've got red diesel as your direct 1, you've got your source of energy and heat and electricity in scope 2, and your scope 3 will be your purchased inputs, how your fertilizer has been manufactured, how your feed has been manufactured, which is why deforestation is such a big issue if you're buying in soya, for example. Now, for a retailer, it can be the case that 60 to 70% of your scope 3 emissions are from food production, or from farming production systems. I was listening to a podcast on the way down here yesterday with Nestle, exactly the same. 2/3 of their emissions in their value chain are from how the food is produced on farm. It's showing up as a really big issue for them because it's huge. When you kind of like put that in the context of their corporate reporting, it's a big issue. And it would be the same for agriculture. It becomes disproportionate for this bank, a theoretical quote, but this comes from another bank that I heard say this. So if they're lending out 100% of their money and 3% of that is going into farming, that 3% is responsible for nearly half of their funded emissions. So if they're, lending the other into either AI generation or whatever it might be, it might be, relatively small proportion, but agriculture is showing up as a problem, and we can't duck this. However, it does mean that we've got these issues around carbon tunnel vision, because if only one thing is important to them, we kind of create these really perverse outcomes. And a great quote yesterday was, "We hit the target but missed the point." It's not my quote, but you can quote me on it. Attribute it to me, but somebody else said it. But I thought that was so powerful because actually that is completely the point. And the great presentation we've just had from Ian shows how blended, great, diverse farming systems can be, but we can't look at them just through this one lens. And so that's why I think natural capital is so interesting, because carbon is part of it, but it's really not the only part at all. Okay, so natural capital into practice. So sort of thinking about here that generic piece around natural capital, but also specifically around where some of the opportunities are going to be coming from. Okay, so this is just to recap. We've got natural capital assets, which are all of the things that you get to control within your farm footprint. We've got the ecosystem services that they provide, and you've got the societal benefits. And then we've got this massive issue that there's this enormous funding gap between the ecosystem services and the societal benefits that are being provided every year, and that is where money, effort, policy is being targeted at creating different outcomes that get us to this place where we're actually a healthy and resilient society. But at farm level, natural capital assets, what would they look like on your balance sheet? So, growing up in a family business, every year you sit down with your accountant, you have your most boring hour of your life, okay, but it's all really relevant. And what they're talking about largely is the pink bit in the middle of this diagram, okay? So your manufactured capital and your financial capital. On your balance sheet, on the right here, your manufactured capital would show up as your fixed assets on your farm. okay? And your financial capital would be your current assets on your farm, so your bank balance basically, okay? And really, on an annual basis, that's how farming kind of goes, oh, we're doing all right, you know, yeah, we can go buy a tractor, or no, we can't go and buy a tractor. You know, that's kind of the extent of what we're really thinking about. But you can see on this diagram, which is from Forum for the Future, I picked this from, you've got social capital and human capital, so that communities and also the staff and the people and maybe all the tax that you're paying within that social capital and human capital. And that all sits in this broader thing, which is natural capital. You know, your farm does not exist. Your manufactured and your financial capital does not sit in isolation to the physical assets of your farm, but those physical natural capital assets of your farm are not on your balance sheet. So one of the tricks of natural capital is to convert those things into a monetary value so that they can be shown on your balance sheet in the same way. Okay, and that's what government's trying to do at a national level through various different kind of complicated processes, is going, well, how do we convert all of these things into a monetary value so we can look at them differently? Now, this is an example we worked on when I was at Savills, where this could be any estate business, but you can see this kind of beautiful waterfall thing going on here, where you've got positive values over here for your direct financial value. This is your income per year, things you're selling off the farm, timber, livestock, crops, for example. The middle bit is the environmental revenue streams, biodiversity, net gain, carbon, whatever it might be. And then you've got these negative things, these negative consequences to society. And this is some of the issues that we've got going on here, is we can't assume that because we're producing food over here that we are positive contributors to society. When we think about natural capital in its totality, some of the things, some of the consequences show up as negatives. So, hang on a minute. So working out what those values are can rely on government coming up with the values, okay, for what those things are and how you would add them up. And in particular for carbon, it's using a value of £260 per tonne. It's the social value, the cost to society for every tonne of carbon that we produce, which is why those figures, livestock methane emissions, for example, show up big and red. And this is why we kind of, you know, we're in this kind of situation where I think a lot of farmers think, oh, it's okay because we're doing this and that means we're all right. But actually, from a government perspective and from a retailer perspective, you start to think about these negative consequences in water pollution. Somebody somewhere at some point is going to have to pick up the bill for those things. This is the debt to future society, right? So how are we factoring them into the present in order to be able to make different decisions about them? So this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to create markets for nature-based solutions where you're taking these uncosted but expensive things to society that nobody is paying for, right? Not even, you know, us as business owners. You know, society, business owners, there's no tax on this, there's no regulation on this, there's no opportunity on this. And we're trying to get them into this bucket where people might pay us to do things differently. Okay? And this is this innovation and nature-based solutions markets that are moving these things over to this side. And I just mention again, this is not just financial opportunity, this might be regulation. It is as likely that we get told we can't pollute rivers than it is that we get paid not to pollute rivers. Markets for nature-based solutions. There's three different things, and this is England specific because Scotland and Wales are doing this very differently. So England specific. We've got the private market innovating, doing interesting things. We've also got regulatory markets, which are driven by government intervention. And we've also got sort of specifically public schemes, which is just, you know, that public pot. And we can look at them in this idea of how regulated are they? How kind of safe is that regulatory framework that's going on? And then also who's benefiting from them? Is it private concern or is it public in general who are benefiting from them? And this is quite interesting because I think when we think through the opportunities for farmers and the opportunities for landowners, this is speaking to your risk appetite. Like, how risky is this space? We're on this sort of trajectory towards this. Like, these opportunities all speak to your appetite to do these things differently. So something like the England Woodland Creation Offer, broadly in the public interest, very well regulated. I would say pretty low risk. Biodiversity net gain. It's a regulatory market. That's why it's green. Okay, so government have intervened, said all developments need to do their 10% offsetting, 10% uplift. And so biodiversity net gain, public benefit, pretty well regulated. There's a lot of kind of difference in how different LPAs are kind of bringing it out. So it's not consistently regulated. Nutrient neutrality, I would say, was largely in the private interest, not particularly well regulated. Again, there's a huge divergence in how that is being handled. Are we in a nutrient neutrality area here? No, okay, right. Yes, be interesting to see whether the Natural England kind of push it out more broadly. It's causing a lot of issues elsewhere at the moment. And the voluntary carbon markets, in comparison, you would say they were very weakly regulated. They're largely kind of contractual relationships between two parties, and they're really in the private interest, right? They're not in the broader public interest. They're, specifically whoever's buying that offset and a relationship with you as an individual. And we can populate the rest of this graph with map with all of these different other opportunities that come in, and how they kind of like sit within this in terms of who, is it just for you? Is it for the public in general? Is it risky? Is it not risky? And each of these represents perhaps a different way that you as farm businesses could think about your approach. Like, which quadrant of this do you want to be working in? What's your appetite for risk? What's your appetite for kind of innovating into these spaces? And how then are you then collaborating perhaps to reduce some of that risk? Now, what's the obvious one that's missing? Anybody who's seen this presentation before will know. Tis the ultimate nature-based solution. That is my quote. Food is the ultimate nature-based solution. And this is what we forget all of the time. As food-producing businesses, we think that this is not an ecosystem service. It is the ultimate ecosystem service and the one that we're completely dependent on. We've got our strongest trading relationships in this space already. And so I think it's really important we think about the expectations of our supply chains and their need and desire to invest in the resilience of food production before we necessarily go off thinking that these other things are somehow in conflict with them. There are also other opportunities, right? So food, we'll come back to that in a second. The holy grail for farmers in all of this stuff is stacking and bundling. And now this is where kind of food in context of this is really important. So if we think about one natural capital asset, say biodiversity, it's providing different ecosystem services, say pollination and access to nature. That creates different societal benefits. Food is one of them, conservation is another, well-being is a third. Stacking these things up is where we begin to get more interesting value propositions for farming. Sorry, that's technical language. We might be able to make more money from selling lots of these things than we do through just selling food alone, okay, for example. So another example, soil, it's your natural capital asset, provides lots of different ecosystem services, carbon drawdown, water purification, food production, right? Lots of different societal benefits. Now, if we can find markets and opportunities for each of those things, or think about that opportunity for who's going to invest in those things, we begin to create a different value proposition for food production than we had before. Now, stacking is where you sell each of those things to a different buyer. Okay, so obviously your food, your maltster, whoever it might be, might just be buying that one thing, but you might be selling conservation benefits to a third buyer. You might be doing a wellness retreat or something on the same piece of land, and you can sell that to a third buyer. If you begin to stack those things together and bundle them into one buyer, that's bundling. So in this example here, in the food being sold, there's also an expectation that you are providing water services. So it might be, for example, that in whatever you're producing, they insist that you use a winter cover crop after. And it's a condition of supplying into that market that they say you can only grow this for us if you put a winter cover crop in afterwards. But they're not paying you anymore to do it necessarily. Okay, but that's bundling into it together. So some examples. So SFI is simply one buyer. You know, government wants to buy certain kind of outcomes from you, and it's happy to pay you to do all sorts of fun stuff at the moment. National Trust car park, really good example of how you can leverage well-being. Like, they make a lot of money from car parks, unless you remember. But anybody does that, right? You know, to the extent anybody can, you know, get planning permission to put a car park on their farm if they've got something interesting to come and look at. It's the ultimate kind of like stacking of income sources. Woodland Carbon Code, on the other hand, arguably is only really selling carbon, but it might be providing a lot of other benefits in terms of biodiversity, and it's quite prescriptive on how those woodlands can be created, but it's not necessarily paying you any more for that carbon if it's a biodiverse habitat. And this is a really interesting example. And there's some wild farmed people in the room. Shout out to wild farmed. They're paying more for their water purification benefits. So that's being bundled in. And this is the point about that bundling piece here. This is really all about price. So bundling these services together is not a problem, provided you're not underselling those benefits to that particular party. And I think that's the big concern that farmers have with these omnipresent, all-powerful retailers, is that they're coming down and they're saying we're going to expect exactly the same product from you, but we're going to expect all of this other stuff with it, whether it be in a carbon audit or whatever, but we're not going to pay you anymore. And I think that, I kind of challenge that. I think that's a fear, but I don't think it's being played out in reality that any of these corporates are looking at this particular problem. And I think actually the kind of the famous grumpiness of farmers is actually standing us in good stead at the moment to say, hang on a minute, we're not going to change what we're doing unless you begin to pay us differently. So I sort of think that that approach is really working for farming at the moment. Okay, nearly there. What you should do first, in my opinion, some of this stuff, it's out with our control, it's at government level, it's really complicated, right? So at farm level, keep it simple, but you need a baseline, okay? And so John's going to talk a bit about, and Laura's already mentioned about some of the work that's being done. So I've put in this this is a sort of a simplified version of that waterfall graph, but actually what this does, rather than worrying about your financial values and how much you're earning from it, literally just add up what you've got. Like, so the physical quantity of hedgerows, your physical areas of stuff that you're growing, how much of your farm is under a soil management plan, you know, the length of your crop rotation, okay, like simple physical numbers of things that you can add up that are indicative really of the overall environmental impact of the system, but sort of give you basic metrics that you can then work on. So keep it simple. What you'll find is that you go across is that if you're thinking about accessing any of these market opportunities, you will need a lot more data. Okay, and so thinking about complying with the opportunity to do any of those things, the primary thing that you will need is much more information about your system and the difference that the change in management approach is going to create. So physical quantities are great and they're a really good place to start, but they're not going to get you to where you need to go if you want to be really leveraging income for this stuff too. So there is a balance between simple and useful. Soil Association Exchange is one of the businesses that I'm working on. I said earlier about how much I dislike carbon tunnel vision, and it produces these very perverse outcomes for land. Increasingly, we're seeing these very holistic approaches. So 6 different categories of activities, sort of scientifically backed, that provide a much more holistic outcome for farmers. Increasingly, these baselines are enabling money to flow back down from supply chains to farms. So at Oxford the week before last, there's a new £1 million fund attached to Soil Association Exchange, which is backed by Tesco and M&S and Co-op, a couple of other people as well. So that money will flow back to farming, basically. So that, you know, increasingly, there are ways that we are innovating into this space to work out what we've got and what situation we're in, but also so you can pay for these outcomes. And I thought it's worth noting that in Scotland, there's this fairly tough whole farm plan approach that they're getting in Scotland, where you have to do a lot of baselining before you can even access the government schemes. This kind of holistic approach is compatible and allows you to start accessing those government approaches. The other part to note on this is that this is kind of a farmer-led approach, but collaboration is absolutely key. And the way, sorry, this is going to skip, and the way that, I'll ignore that, that's fine. And the way that we need to think about this, note to self that I haven't taken the timings off this slide. Okay, that's fine. Collaboration is absolutely key. Because this is so complicated, and because actually often the opportunities are catchment scale rather than farm scale, working through these things with other farmers is really, really important. But I've put a quote up there that I wrote in a Savills publication in 2022 in the Nature-Based Solutions Spotlight, which basically says that you've got to be sure that you're entering into these opportunities with the right long-term intentions. The best strategy is to ensure that any income generated by grants or nature-based services provided to others is invested back into sustainable land management and restoring natural capital across the whole farm to increase long-term business resilience. I don't know whether there's a timer on this thing, and ensure the farm is fit to meet rising compliance baselines, right? And so I think this is really critical, because all of these opportunities, all of this money that might flow in, is all irrelevant unless you're using that money for the best benefit of your own farm, okay? And so understanding what natural capital have you got is the first bit. Who you can then work with to create that self-responsibility and opportunity, create those meaningful baselines, but be ready for this supply chain accountability, and then working out who wants to pay you from that. Collaboration is really key in order to make sense of this at farm level, okay? It wants me to stop.
Thank you, Emma.
Thank you all.